Hi, welcome back to Mooc BHS130 Anatomy and Physiology 1. Today is the last part of the respiratory system, part 3, and we will dive in further on the respiratory centers of the brain and talk a little bit on what happened during aging. So are you ready? Are you ready? Let's begin. The learning outcome for this session is that at the end of this session, the students will be able to describe respiratory centers of the brain, aging, and the respiratory system. For your own benefit, I have actually uploaded the video on respiratory centers of the brain, and you can actually view it to understand this topic better. Respiratory centers of the brain. There are two main respiratory centers of the brain, namely the medullary centers and also the pons. The medullary centers has these respiratory rhythmicity centers that set the pace, namely the DRG, dorsal respiratory group, and the VRG, ventral respiratory group. From the name itself, dorsal means the back, ventral means anterior, which is the front part. Another part is the pons that has apneustic and pneumothoracic centers. So as you can see in the picture, we have this one that I highlighted. It's the medullary rhythmicity area, okay, found in the medulla, DRG and VRG group. And we do have what we have in the pons area here, pneumothoracic and apneustic center. And they receive the information from the higher centers on the top here. As you might know that breathing is involuntary, means you cannot control the breathing, but the muscles are under voluntary control. So the respiratory centers in your brain are groups of neurons in the brain that control inspiration, inhale, and expiration, exhale, based in the medulla and the pons. As mentioned earlier, the respiratory centers of the brain receive the stimulus from the higher brain center. The medullary respiratory center is in the brainstem and has a center that controls the inspiration and also the expiration. There is what we call the DRG and VRG group. The dorsal respiratory group, DRG, is responsible for stimulating and contraction of the diaphragm through the phrenic nerves, whereas the ventral respiratory group, VRG, stimulates the external and internal intercostal through the intercostal nerves. The control of respiration is a neural mechanism. Simply means it involves respiratory centers, afferent and efferent nerves that is from the brain. And again, each is divided into a medullary rhythmicity area in the medulla oblongata, consisting of inspiratory and expiratory areas. Another area is in the pons that includes pneumothoracic area and apneustic area. Here in the picture, you can see pons and medulla oblongata. Pons is above medulla oblongata, and in the pons you have two areas of respiratory center, pneumothoracic area and apneustic area. Whereas in the medulla oblongata, you have your inspiratory area and expiratory area as shown in the picture. So what does medullary rhythmicity area do? It basically controls basic rhythm of respiratory, consists of inspiratory and expiratory area as shown earlier on. The inspiratory area generates the nerve impulse and establish the basic rhythm of breathing for about 2 seconds, whereas expiratory area remain inactive and exhalation. Diaphragm and external intercostal muscle relax and lungs recoil for about 3 seconds during quiet breathing. For pneumothoracic area found in the pons, okay, so what does it do? It coordinates the transition between inhalation and exhalation. From the upper part of the pons as shown in the picture earlier on, transmit inhibitory impulses to inspiratory area. Inhibitory simply means it does not allow, and then it turns off the inspiratory area before the lungs become too full. As for apneustic area in the pons, it also coordinates the transition between inhalation and exhalation processes, found on the lower parts of the bones below the pneumothoracic area. It transmits stimulatory impulses to the inspiratory area of active breathing. So stimulatory means it allows it to happen and all the processes repeat. The interesting facts about respiratory centers is that both pons and medulla are very important, essential for breathing. And the bronchioles and alveoli have stretch receptors that respond to extreme overinflation that can damage lungs. And when overinflation happens, impulses are sent from the stretch receptors found in the bronchioles and the alveoli to the medulla by the vagus nerves. And soon after inspiration ends, expiration occurs. So it allows the impulses to tell the brain, especially to the medulla, to act immediately. When they inspire the air, they have to expire it as soon as possible. And during exercise, we normally breathe more vigorously, okay, and deeply because the brain centers send more impulses to the respiratory muscles. And this condition is known as hyperapnea, in which you will actually breathe more and faster. Next, we look at the respiratory reflexes. Now, the respiratory centers are modified by sensory information, influenced by few reflexes. The first one, and very important, is chemoreceptor reflexes, and normally we look into the level of carbon dioxide. We do have baroreceptor reflexes. We call it hearing-Breuer reflexes. This is where the reflexes where it detects too much air inside the lung, it will actually automatically send impulses to the brain to allow the brain to ask the medulla oblongata to take action to shrink and expire all the excess air. And we also have protective reflexes such as sneeze and cough reflexes. Control of breathing. There are several factors that controls breathing. First and foremost, we have to know that pain, emotion, and temperature stimuli is acting through the hypothalamus found in the brain. The stretch receptors, which is found in the bronchioles and the alveoli in the lungs, will initiate hearing-Breuer reflex to prevent overinflation of the lungs. And sometimes irritants can also stimulate modified air movement. And if the irritants is in the nasal cavity, it will initiate sneeze reflex. And if irritants is found in the lung, it will initiate cough reflex. So this will actually allow or causes the protective reflexes. And we know that we have two types of chemoreceptors, peripheral chemoreceptors found in the carotid bodies and aorta that are very sensitive to the concentration of ion hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and also oxygen. And in the medullary chemoreceptors, which is also known as central chemoreceptors in medulla oblongata, are very sensitive to carbon dioxide level and also ion hydrogen concentration. So in the picture, you can see that we have peripheral chemoreceptors, which are very sensitive to oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen level. More on the higher side of carbon dioxide and hydrogen, lower side of the oxygen. And we have the central chemoreceptors known as the medullary chemoreceptors, also influenced by the concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen. And we have the stretch receptors in the lungs, found in the bronchioles and also in the alveoli. And then we have the irritant receptors. If it is in the nasal cavity, it will cause sneeze reflex. And if it is in the lung cavity, it will cause cough reflex. And all this will get the information from the higher brain centers to act upon. And we know that the respiratory centers are found in the medullary oblongata and also the pons. And here you can see the peripheral chemoreceptors found on the carotid body and also the aortic bodies or the aorta. The hearing-Breuer reflex shows that if there is an increase of volume of air inside the lung, the central chemoreceptors and also peripheral chemoreceptors will be triggered, will be influenced, and then they send impulses to the medullary respiratory centers. give impulses of signals to respiratory muscles to act upon it, increase ventilation so that more carbon dioxide is exhaled, and finally to restore the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and pH returns to normal. Here, there is again the comparison between the central and peripheral chemoreceptors. Central chemoreceptors is found in medulla oblongata, and peripheral chemoreceptors is found in the carotid or aortic arch. And both are triggered by the concentration of carbon dioxide, the oxygen level, and the blood pH, in which we talk about hydrogen ion. So the same goes with the earlier photos. They will actually send signals to the brainstem respiratory centers, and then allowing the signals or impulses tells the muscles of breathing and did what they should do, and alveolar ventilation happened in order to restore the normal level of carbon dioxide, oxygen level, and also the blood pH. As repeated many times, the chemical factors affecting the rate of breathing would be the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the blood. And here, if the carbon dioxide level is actually high, the blood pH will drop, meaning to say there are more ion hydrogen, which led to an increase in the rate and depth of breathing. And when the carbon dioxide increases, there will be also a lot of carbonic acid. Therefore, it will increase the ion hydrogen concentration, and this will cause the blood pH to drop. The value drops. The changes in carbon dioxide in blood will stimulate the medulla centers, whereas the changes in oxygen concentration are detected by chemoreceptors in aorta and carotid artery, which is the peripheral chemoreceptors, and then only send the impulses to medulla. Hyperventilation is a term that increases breathing rate and depth when carbon dioxide accumulates in blood and then the blood pH drops. This action will blow off more carbon dioxide, decrease the amount of carbonic acid, and return blood pH to normal. As you can see the equation stated here, increased carbon dioxide will actually reduce the blood pH, and in order to bring back or restore the normal concentration, the person has to hyperventilate, breathe in faster and deep, and then only then the carbon dioxide will goes down and the pH will be normalized. On the other hand, hyperventilation is a prolonged shallow breathing that can dramatically change the amount of carbonic acid in the blood, leading to hypercapnia. That means an increased amount of carbon dioxide in the blood. During hyperventilation, carbonic acid increase. During hyperventilation, carbonic acid decrease. In short, this is what happened in the respiratory control center in the medulla oblongata that controls the respiration rate. It will sense the amount of the carbon dioxide and regulates the amount of carbon dioxide released during exhalations by sending impulses to the intercostal muscles and diaphragm, and whether to hyperventilate or hypoventilate after that. Alright, when there is active cellular activity, normally the carbon dioxide level will increase. This will further reduce the pH level of the blood, and it will be detected by the central chemoreceptor in medulla oblongata. Remember, the central chemoreceptor is very sensitive to carbon dioxide level. So what happens next is the diaphragm and intercostal muscles will work. They contract and relax faster by increasing the rate and the rate of breathing and ventilation, which we call hyperventilation, and with that the normal concentration of carbon dioxide and pH value will be restored. Moving on to the peripheral chemoreceptor found in the aortic bodies, which is the aortic arch, and carotid bodies, which is the carotid artery. These are very sensitive to both carbon dioxide content and also pH of blood. Now, if the level of oxygen is severely low at high altitudes, usually the peripheral chemoreceptor is stimulated and nerve impulses are then sent to the respiratory centers. At high altitudes, meaning to say at a very high place, atmospheric pressure is low, therefore it is normal that a person is having difficulty to breathe. The partial pressure of oxygen also decrease, therefore there is a drop in oxygen level of blood. The person will experience headaches, nausea and dizziness for first few days. However, after few days later, the body will become acclimatized, meaning to say adapt to the condition as hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen is reduced and more oxygen released to body tissues. So here is what happens when the peripheral chemoreceptors found on the walls of the aorta and carotid arteries, which is found in the neck, sense there is a low of oxygen. They will send nerve impulses to the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata will do exactly like what chemical chemoreceptors will actually do. The rate of breathing and ventilation increases to obtain more oxygen and the concentration of oxygen back to normal. However, the respiratory center usually does not respond directly to oxygen level. It is more sensitive to carbon dioxide level. Now, there are other factors affecting breathing. In our brain, there is chemosensitive areas that detect concentrations of chemicals like carbon dioxide and hydrogen. We all know that breathing is affected greatly by the concentration of carbon dioxide. So when there's a rise in carbon dioxide, normally the person will actually breathe faster to compensate and also to blow off the carbon dioxide from the lung. And also if there is a low blood oxygen in the body, the peripheral chemoreceptors will detect found on the carotid and aortic bodies will sense the changes and sense impulses to the medulla oblongata and do next. And then we have inflation reflex, which is the hearing Brier reflex that regulates the depth of breathing, prevents overinflation of the lungs. And last but not least, we also have emotional sad, fear and pain, where normally when you are in fear, you are trying to actually breathe faster. Okay, and because of that, you are actually hyperventilating when you are in fear. As we have discussed earlier, hyperventilation is where your breathing will increase by bringing down the concentration of carbon dioxide. Easier to do this is actually to breathe into a bag that can restore carbon dioxide concentration, either a plastic bag or a paper bag. So we know that breathing is an involuntary control. However, there are parts that we can actually control our respiration, known as voluntary control of respiration. Our conscious thought can affect the respiratory rate by stimulating centers in the hypothalamus, especially in an emotional state found in the limbic system can affect our respiratory rate by stimulating the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, such as when you are in fear, when you are in pain, you will normally tell yourself to breathe more. And the brain sends the signals and us will actually send the impulses to your intercostal space, into your diaphragm to actually do the action of breathing faster. The atmospheric pressure. In the previous section, you come across this number 760 millimeters mercury. This is the pressure necessary for breathing, which is why it is difficult to breathe in high altitudes and why a punctured lung can be dangerous. 760 millimeters mercury are the same anywhere you go, either you're in Canada, Australia, Indonesia, okay, outside the home, inside the home, except for higher altitudes. And a hole in a pleural cavity can cause the lung to collapse or deflate. And this condition is known as pneumothorax, collapsed lung, where the air fills the space but not inside the lung. Now, the last part of this topic is that we talk about a little bit on aging and respiratory system. We all know as we grow older, the efficiency of the respiratory system decreases. Why is it so? Because our elastic tissue deteriorates, causing lower lung compliance and vital capacity. Vital capacity refers to our ability of our lung to actually fill up with air. And there is arthritic changes carried within the lungs that restrict chest movements, and some degree of emphysema occurs typically. Emphysema is the damage to the alveoli. The most common disease we encounter is the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, which is an obstruction of the airways that occurs with chronic bronchitis, inflammation and excess mucus in the bronchi, and also emphysema, the damage of the alveoli, or it can be both, to create COPD. And do you know who is the culprit of the common cause of COPD and emphysema? It is smoking. Therefore, if you look at this picture, in a healthy people, the lungs are light pink, but in smokers, the lungs appear dark and molted. So please love your lungs, and that marks the end of this session. I hope you have learned and enjoyed the session well. And to test your knowledge, please go and answer the quiz found in this chapter to see whether you understand and will be able to explain the respiratory system. Till then, till we meet again, thank you very much for your attention and all the best.